The quantum transmitter buzzed against Naasir's wrist like an angry wasp. Another timeline violation. He pulled up his sleeve to check the holographic display, already knowing what he'd find. The coordinates pointed to ancient Egypt, 1340 BCE, the reign of Pharaoh Akhenaten and Queen Nefertiti. "Damn it, Malik," he muttered, fingers flying across the projected keyboard. "What are you doing now?" The Timekeepers Council had strict protocols about timeline interference, especially during pivotal historical periods. The rise of Akhenaten's monotheistic revolution was one such nexus point. Any manipulation could send ripples through time that would fundamentally alter human civilization. And Malik knew this better than anyone. He'd been one of their best before he went rogue. Naasir's quarters in the Temporal Preservation Complex materialized around him. A sparse room with white walls that could transform into any environment needed for mission prep. "Computer, give me everything we have on Akhenaten's reign. Focus on the first 5 years." The walls shimmered and came alive with hieroglyphic texts, archaeological photographs, and historical reconstructions. At the center floated a three-dimensional model of the ancient city of Thebes. "Timeline violation detected," the AI announced in its characteristically calm voice. "Multiple anomalies emerging from focal point. Historical variance currently at 3.2% and rising." Naasir cussed under his breath. Even a 1% variance could have catastrophic consequences. At 5%, the timeline would begin to fragment irreparably. He grabbed his field kit, a leather satchel containing period-appropriate clothing and tools, plus carefully disguised quantum tech that would allow him to track Malik's movements through time. The kit's contents would pass any ancient Egyptian's scrutiny while giving him the edge he needed to complete his mission. "Computer, initiate temporal jump sequence. Target coordinates locked." The familiar sensation of quantum displacement began to build. Like every atom in his body was being gently pulled in 1,000 different directions at once. Naasir had done this hundreds of times, but the pre-jump jitters never quite went away. One small miscalculation, one tiny error in the quantum equations, and he could materialize inside a wall or 500 feet in the air. As the quantum field intensified around him, Naasir thought about his last conversation with Malik, just days before his former friend had gone rogue. They'd been discussing the philosophical implications of their work over synthetic whiskey in the complex's recreation room. "We're like gods, Naasir," Malik had said, his eyes fever-bright with conviction. "We have the power to reshape history, to guide humanity toward a better future. But instead, we sit here and watch, doing nothing while civilizations rise and fall, while millions suffer needlessly. You know why we can't interfere," Naasir had argued. "The butterfly effect is a convenient excuse for inaction," Malik had cut him off. "The ancient Egyptians understood something we've forgotten. Their gods walked among them, shaped their destiny. What if they weren't gods at all, but people like us? What if we're meant to be those gods?" The quantum field reached critical density. The last thing Naasir saw before the jump was the mission clock starting its countdown. 72 hours to find Malik and prevent whatever he was planning before the timeline damage became permanent. Reality twisted, folded, and reassembled itself around him. The sterile white walls of the complex were replaced by the sweltering heat of an Egyptian afternoon. He'd materialized in a narrow alley between two mud brick buildings, exactly where he'd planned. The smell of dust, sweat, and cooking fires filled his nostrils. Naasir quickly changed into his period clothing, a simple white shendik kilt and sandals, appropriate for a middle-class scribe, which would allow him to move freely through most areas of the city without drawing attention. He encrypted his modern equipment with a quantum lock and hid it within a seemingly ordinary wooden box, accessible to him but invisible to the technology of this era. As he stepped out of the alley into the bustling street, his augmented vision overlay highlighted temporal distortions, traces of Malik's passage through time. They led toward the great temple complex of Karnak, where Pharaoh Akhenaten had begun his religious reforms. The streets of Thebes were alive with activity. Merchants hawked their wares from wooden stalls, slaves carried heavy water jars on their shoulders, and priests walked in solemn procession toward the temples. None of them knew that their entire civilization stood on the brink of a massive change. Both the historical one they were meant to experience, and whatever unauthorized alteration Malik was planning. A commotion near the temple gates drew his attention. A crowd was gathering, their voices raised in excitement or alarm. Naasir's temporal scanner picked up strong distortion readings from that direction. He pushed his way through the crowd, using his scribe status to claim a need to record important events. What he saw made his blood run cold. Standing before the massive temple pylons was a figure that should not exist in this time period. A hybrid of ancient Egyptian and futuristic technology. It appeared to be a statue of Anubis, the jackal-headed god, but its eyes glowed with quantum energy, and its surface rippled with impossible hieroglyphs that seemed to move and change. "Behold!" A familiar voice boomed from within the temple. "The gods return to walk among you, Malik." But he wasn't just changing history now. He was completely rewriting it. A woman's voice cut through the odd murmurs of the crowd, sharp with authority. "What is the meaning of this blasphemy?" Naasir turned to see a figure that made his historian's heart skip a beat. Even without his historical database confirming her identity, he would have known that face from countless ancient artworks. The sharp cheekbones, the elegant neck, the royal bearing that no artist had ever fully captured. Queen Nefertiti herself. She stood at the top of the temple steps, her golden uraeus crown glinting in the sun, surrounded by guards and priests. Her expression was a mixture of outrage and fascination as she stared at the impossible statue. And in that moment, Naasir realized that preserving the timeline had just become far more complicated. Because according to every historical record in the Timekeepers database, Queen Nefertiti wasn't supposed to be anywhere near Thebes on this day. The temporal variance counter on his hidden display ticked up to 4.1%. Time was running out. The quantum readings from Queen Nefertiti were impossible. Naasir checked his temporal scanner 3 times, but the results didn't change. The Queen's temporal signature showed traces of quantum displacement, the same kind produced by Timekeeper technology. But these traces were old, decades old in her timeline, predating both his and Malik's arrival in ancient Egypt. Someone had contacted her before. Someone had given her knowledge of the Timekeepers. Yeah. Nefertiti's voice cut through his thoughts. She was looking directly at him now, her dark eyes seeming to pierce through his carefully constructed scribe's disguise. "I know what you are. Come with me." The guards moved to flank him. Naasir noticed their spears bore microscopic engravings, quantum encryption patterns that wouldn't be discovered for another 3,000 years. His mind raced. How deep did this temporal manipulation go? Inside the temple's private chambers, Nefertiti dismissed everyone except 2 guards whose weapons hummed with barely perceptible quantum energy. The queen pulled a scarab amulet from beneath her robes. Its surface rippled with the same shifting hieroglyphs as Malik's Anubis statue. "Your friend isn't the first timekeeper to walk among us," she said, her voice carrying the weight of hidden knowledge. "They came to us during the reign of my father-in-law, Amenhotep III. They revealed themselves as what you call temporal preservationists, claiming they were here to protect the flow of time." Naasir's training kicked in. "Your Majesty, I'm not authorized to discuss temporal matters with historical figures?" She smiled, but there was steel beneath it. "That protocol was written after what happened here. After what we discovered during Amenhotep's reign." She pressed the scarab amulet, and a holographic map of time itself appeared between them. A technology that shouldn't exist for millennia. Lines of temporal energy flowed like the Nile itself, and at their center was this period, this dynasty. "Your leaders didn't tell you everything, Timekeeper. Egypt isn't just a nexus of historical importance. It's a temporal watershed. The decisions made here, the monuments we built, they're not just structures of stone. They're anchors in time itself." The implications staggered him. "The pyramids are temporal stabilization points," she confirmed. "Built with knowledge given to us by the first Timekeepers. Your friend Malik discovered this truth, didn't he? That's why he's here." A cold realization crept over Naasir. The religious reforms that Akhenaten introduces, the switch to monotheism, was meant to concentrate temporal energy through a single point of worship, yes. But something went wrong. The power became too concentrated, too dangerous. "That's why," she stopped, catching herself. "But you already know what happens to Akhenaten, don't you? To his city? To me?" Naasir did know. The mysterious disappearance of Nefertiti from historical records, the abandonment of Akhenaten's city, the violent return to the old gods. It was all there in the Timekeeper archives. But now he wondered how much of that history had been shaped by his own organization. A quantum tremor shook the temple, stronger than any Naasir had felt before. The temporal variance counter spiked to 4.7%. "He's trying to access the temporal nexus beneath the temple," Nefertiti said urgently. "If he succeeds, he won't just change history. He'll break it completely." Why are you telling me this? Why help me? Nefertiti's expression softened for a moment, showing a glimpse of vulnerability beneath the royal facade. Because I've seen what happens when people try to play God with time. The first timekeepers thought they could control it, use Egypt's temporal energy to prevent what they saw as catastrophic futures. Their actions. She gripped the scarab amulet tightly. Let's just say there's a reason your organization now has such strict protocols about interference. Another tremor, stronger this time. Dust fell from the temple ceiling. The temporal nexus, Naasir said. How do we stop him from accessing it? We don't. Nefertiti's eyes gleamed with the same determination he'd seen in countless ancient portraits. We beat him to it. The nexus responds to royal blood, blood of the pharaohs. Blood that carries traces of the original temporal manipulation. She swept toward a hidden doorway, the quantum-enhanced guards falling in behind her. Come, Timekeeper. Let me show you what your predecessors helped us build beneath the sands of Egypt. And let me show you why some points in history are meant to remain exactly as they are. As Naasir followed her into the darkness below the temple, his temporal scanner picked up readings that should have been impossible. A concentration of temporal energy greater than anything in the Timekeeper's records. Whatever was down there, whatever Malik was trying to access, it was becoming increasingly clear that the true history of his organization, and of ancient Egypt itself, was far stranger than he'd ever imagined. The variance counter ticked up to 4.9%. They had minutes at most, before the timeline began to fracture irreparably. And somewhere in the darkness ahead, Malik was waiting. The passages beneath the temple descended in a perfect spiral, marked with hieroglyphs that shifted between ancient Egyptian and quantum code. Each step downward increased the temporal energy readings on Naasir's scanner, until they nearly overloaded the device. The air itself seemed to vibrate with chronological tension. Your friend has already disabled the outer seals, Nefertiti said as they reached a vast underground chamber. He's more clever than the ones who came before. The chamber took Naasir's breath away. It was a perfect sphere carved from black stone, its surface covered in concentric circles of hieroglyphs that moved like flowing water. At its center, suspended in mid-air, was a sphere of pure temporal energy, rainbow-colored light that seemed to fold in on itself endlessly. The heart of the nexus, Nefertiti explained. The point where all of Egypt's temporal ley lines converge. Welcome to the true heart of history. Malik's voice echoed through the chamber. He stepped out from behind the floating sphere, his timekeeper uniform modified with ancient Egyptian elements. The quantum tech woven into his clothes pulsed with power. I was wondering when you'd join us, old friend. Naasir moved to step forward, but Nefertiti held him back. The floor, she warned. The patterns are a temporal maze. One wrong step and you'll be scattered across 1,000 timelines. Malik smiled. She's right. I lost 2 clone probes figuring out the safe path. The ancient timekeepers were nothing if not thorough with their security measures. He gestured to the sphere. But it was worth it. Do you know what this is, Naasir? What it can do? It's a temporal nexus, Naasir said. A concentration of time itself. It's so much more than that. Malik's eyes gleamed with fervor. It's the master key to history. The ancient timekeepers found it by accident when they first came to Egypt. They tried to control it by building the pyramids as stabilization points, by guiding the pharaohs to create religious practices that would contain its power. But they never fully understood what they had discovered. Nefertiti stepped forward, her feet finding an invisible path across the temporal maze. They understood enough to know it was too dangerous to use. The human mind wasn't meant to comprehend all of time at once, let alone control it. The human mind, no, Malik agreed. But I've spent years preparing myself, augmenting my consciousness with quantum processors. I can handle it. I can finally do what the timekeepers were always meant to do. Make history better. Timelines, Alexander the Great marching through a modern city, the pyramids rising from a nuclear wasteland, Cleopatra addressing the Roman Senate through a hologram. The containment field is collapsing. Nefertiti shouted over the growing temporal storm. If we don't stabilize it now, the fractures will spread beyond Egypt. Beyond this time period. Beyond our ability to fix it, Malik finished. His hands were pressed against his temples, quantum processors struggling to process the competing timelines. The nexus. It's trying to correct itself. Trying to snap back to the original timeline. But it needs a sacrifice, Nefertiti said quietly. It's always needed a sacrifice. Why do you think I disappeared from history? Naasir's eyes widened as understanding struck him. You're going to use yourself as an anchor point. She nodded, her royal composure unwavering even as reality crumbled around them. My disappearance was never a historical mystery. Timekeeper. It was a choice. My choice. To preserve the timeline, to keep this power contained, someone of royal blood had to be bound to the Nexus. To become part of it. But it won't work this time, Malik gasped. The destabilization is too severe. The Nexus needs more. It needs balance, Naasir said. He looked at his oldest friend, seeing the same realization dawn in Malik's eyes. One to preserve, one to change. The variance counter hit 4.99%. Malik straightened up, his expression clearing. Together then, old friend? Naasir nodded, managing a smile. Like in training? They moved in perfect synchronization, just as they had in countless Timekeeper exercises. Malik to the left of the sphere, Naasir to the right. Their quantum signatures aligned, creating a stabilizing resonance. You know what this means, Malik said softly. We'll be written out of time. Become like her. Living anchors in the temporal matrix. Better than letting history shatter. Naasir reached out his hand across the sphere. See you in eternity? Malik grasped it. In every timeline. Nefertiti raised her scarab amulet, its quantum patterns aligning with the hieroglyphs on the walls. Your sacrifice will not be forgotten. Timekeepers. I will make sure of it. The temporal sphere expanded, enveloping both men. Naasir felt his consciousness stretching, expanding across countless timelines. He saw the great sweep of history. Past, present, and all possible futures. He saw Nefertiti return to the surface alone, crafting the story that would become history. He saw her orchestrate her own public disappearance, joining them in their eternal vigil. And he saw something else, something that made his last moments of individual consciousness fill with wonder. In every ancient Egyptian temple, in every hieroglyph of the gods Thoth and Anubis, he saw echoes of himself and Malik. The two timekeepers who became living myths, guardians of history's greatest secrets. The variance counter dropped back to 0. In the sacred texts hidden in the deepest vaults of the Timekeeper complex, 3,000 years in the future, a new passage would appear. In the time of Akhenaten and Nefertiti, when the barriers between moments grew thin, two guardians gave themselves to time that time itself might live. Look for them in the spaces between seconds, in the quantum shadows of the pyramids, in the mysterious symbols left by a queen who understood that some sacrifices echo through eternity. For though they vanished from history's pages, they live still, watching, preserving, keeping the great river of time flowing true. Above ground, in the temple of Karnak, a new hieroglyph appeared on the wall. One that would puzzle archaeologists for millennia to come. It showed two figures, perfectly balanced, holding between them a sphere that looked remarkably like a clock. And in the quantum shadows beneath the Egyptian sands, three consciousness merged with time itself became the greatest secret of the ancient world. The true Pharaoh's timekeepers, guardians eternal, preserving history's flow until the end of time itself.